Alrighty, sorry, let's get started. Okay, so you don't have this slide, and just don't worry about it too much. I just kind of threw it in because I've mentioned this a couple of times, and I just wanted to, and I keep forgetting. And actually, I was having trouble finding where in this other course I teach I have this slide where I'm talking about market theories of religion, and so I finally found it yesterday, and I was like, oh, I should just bring it in very quickly. This is something I tacked onto religious markets. But basically, there's two things I kind of wanted to point out here. So this is a poem, a very famous one. Like if you end up ever reading through the literature on source of religion, almost every article that talks about secularization, like not everyone, but a lot of them, start with a quote from this poem, which is called On Dover Beach. It's by a guy named Matthew Arnold, published in 1855, but probably written somewhere around 1822. And this is in England, right? The sea of faith was once too at the full and round the earth's shores lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear the melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night. Right. So basically, like, oh, once the world was filled with faith, and now it's retreating. Now, people always cite this as like, sort of like evidence of secularization or the sentiment of religious people with secularization. What I think is kind of interesting is that the period where, Arnold writes this, right, in the 1820s, is right before a great flourishing of religious faith in England, where that, it may have been at a kind of low ebb following, the end of the first Great Awakening, right? It kind of withdrew and became less intense, but Arnold would have been writing it somewhere in the kind of middle of the second Great Awakening. And by the time you get to, the third Great Awakening, which will end in the 1930s, England and then the United States are basically as religious as they have ever been, right? In terms of church attendance and church membership, more so in a lot of ways than they ever were before. And so, I only bring this up, this is sometimes, I think, a good support for this idea of self-limiting secularization that I talked about last class, that, it sometimes appears like faith is withdrawing, but, especially for Anglo-America, it's gone through these stages of great awakenings, and arguably we're seeing awakenings happening in places like India of Hindu faith, like in Turkey of Muslim faith, and across the Islamic world. And so, sometimes this idea of secularization could be an illusion. And certainly in the past, right, arguably the fourth Great Awakening in the West sort of ended around 1980. And then, the kind of come down from that, maybe we're in the bottoming out of that high wave. So anyway, I wanted to bring that in just because I kept talking about it and kept talking about this poem and never actually showed it to you. So there it is. Okay. We're talking about the rise of Christianity. Rodney Stark's sociological classic book. We kind of started talking about it last time. And basically we ended off... All right, it won't go down anymore. We ended off with this slide, right? We're talking about so we were talking about, conversion and Christian growth, right? And Stark's estimate that you could get to roughly where history tells us you should be, right? From about 100 Christians around the end of the life of Jesus, right? Around 33 AD, to the dominant kind of religion of the Roman Empire, somewhere around 30 million by 350 through normal sociological processes. And again, some of the arguments that Stark is sort of trying to rebut here is things like it had to be a miracle, right? We needed mass conversions and something miraculous to happen for Christianity to go from this small group to the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the kind of time period we're talking about. Because 350 years, less than that, even 320 years, doesn't seem like a lot of time from our perspective, but it can happen. And Stark, again, he's pointing to, all right, how do religions actually spread? And he says, our impression is always, and this is where we ended off, and we talked about, the Mormons and Stark and Laughlin's research on the Moonies, that our impression is always that people convert to a religion because they're presented with the message of that religion, And they find that message so convincing and appealing that they then convert to that religion. And what Stark and Laughlin said is not so, right? Actually, our observations of the Moonies and then subsequent work that Stark does on the Mormons suggest that people convert to new religions based not on beliefs, but on belonging, right? That first, their social bonds within that religious group grow, and eventually once they sort of outweigh their bonds outside, right? So their romantic partner or their really close friends, are within that group. At that point, when those bonds, outweigh the bonds outside, then they convert. But it looks like, very backwards from what we sort of, I think, have been conditioned to expect, right? That people go from belief to behavior to belonging. Stark says it's actually the opposite, right? People go from belonging to behavior to belief, right? So first they belong to the group, then they start to, attend and do things that are religious in nature and in behavior. And then only after, once they've adopted those practices, then they start to believe the beliefs, right? But opposite of what we kind of think typically, right? So unlikely, he thinks, that street preaching in late antiquity resulted in mass conversions, but instead he thinks that Christianity probably grew slowly through social bonds. Yeah, Jessica.
Could you make the argument that's why you're more likely to be religious if your family's religious, and that's could also explain why you're less likely to convert when you're older, because at that point you have so many bonds with a certain religious community. You're like, well,
I think that's a very, very reasonable argument to make. Yeah, I mean, your parents are your most important social bonds, right? And the ones that, for most people, you care the most about maintaining, right? Because they're your parents. And so, yeah, if your parents and your family are quite religious, you're likely to remain quite religious because those bonds are important to you, and deconverting would jeopardize those social bonds in major ways. And there'd have to be someone, some other social bonds that are stronger outside of your family, maybe a spouse, to kind of draw you, a romantic partner to draw you away from that, right? And I mean, not for nothing, we see often where people leave religious groups, especially in adolescence, is because they started getting romantically involved with someone who was either of another religion or non-religious, right? That's a powerful kind of pull away from being religious because you really want to align your behavior and beliefs with the person you're romantically involved with for lots of reasons. Yeah, Yes, you're right. I answered your question by rambling on for 5 minutes. But you were right all along. Okay. Alrighty. So, the class basis of early Christianity. And this is where Stark takes a shot at probably his least favorite school of thought in sociology, which is Marxism. Because there's always been, and I think I've inherited Stark's dislike of Marxism in general. All right, but it's long been held, right? If we go back to deprivation theory, right? This basic kind of Marxian understanding of why people become religious, right? Because they're poor, because they're destitute, because, something has gone badly in their lives and they need the comfort of religion to basically help them get through. And I mean, Stark says this has basically long been held, by scholars like Friedrich Engels, Edward Gibbon, the famous historian of Rome, right, who wrote the multi-volume Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, held this view. Edwin R. Goodenough held this view as well. And it's, I think been widely kind of disseminated through a sort of, I don't want to sound like Jordan Peterson because I'm not making that claim, but like a cultural Marxism. I mean more the way that kind of, the long-standing thoughts of Marx have sort of disseminated through people's consciousness in ways that people might not be aware of, was that really, Christianity appealed mostly in its early days to the lower classes of Roman society, right? That because the poor in Roman society were so ill-treated, they were so poor, right? There were slaves, lots of slaves in Roman society, that Christianity would have been particularly appealing to these people. However, more kind of recent history, and Stark cites Judge 1960, but you can look at, more modern historians, even people like The Tom Holland, who I've cited and talked about many times in the course. There is, there's a book called The Last Pagan Generation. I can't remember the author at the time, but it basically backs up this sort of belief as well. But yeah, kind of more recent history, right? Better history than what Engels had. And Engels was not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, has suggested that the lowest class of Roman society, the peasants and slaves, actually did not convert to Christianity. And that's where we get this sort of weird, what we now think of as a very common word, right? The word pagan, right? Pagan meaning, in Western thought, kind of anyone who is non-Christian. But the word paganus in Latin meant basically peasant, right? Person living in the countryside. So it was kind of people in urban centers in Rome that adopted Christianity more than, the slaves and peasants bound to the land. So who ends up actually adopting Christianity? Well, we have pretty good evidence, I think, that there was at least some large component of the early Christian community that was middle and probably upper class, right? That this seems to have appealed to, people who were of some social standing. So, early Christian writers, right, including Paul, seem to be addressing in a lot of cases a sort of middle class audience, right? Paul will, at certain points, make admonitions that, even if you're rich, you shouldn't expect to get the best seat in the house, when Christians gather. You should be sitting with everybody else. It's pretty clear that Paul has certain wealthy and powerful, especially female, supporters, right? Phoebe, in particular, mentioned I believe in the letter to the Romans, seems to be a wealthy patroness of Paul. And yeah, we have a lot of evidence that the early church had, some rich benefactors. And in particular, we know that the wives of powerful Roman officials often interceded on behalf of Christians to stop persecution. And, presumably because these wives themselves were Christian. To the point where, I can't remember, it wasn't Eusebius. I'm trying to remember which. Polycarp, Saint Polycarp, was on his way to being basically executed, and he begged of his, supporters not to intervene on his behalf. Why? Because he wanted to be martyred for Christ, and he was afraid, essentially, that one of the wives of a powerful Roman official would essentially come and get him off the hook, and he wouldn't get to die for Jesus, right? So he's in his kind of farewell speech as he's being dragged off, to be eaten by lions, I believe, or burned at the stake. Was Polycarp burned at the stake? I think he might have been burned at the stake. Anyway, he's begging, that please don't intercede on my behalf, because presumably this had happened, before, where Christians were about to be martyred. The wife of some official went to her husband and said, could you get this guy off the hook? And it had happened, right? So, we can have a pretty good sense of that. Okay, so, some basic terms that we'll need for the future here to understand what Christianity was in its kind of early days. So we can have this distinction between, sects, cults, or new religious movements. So sects, right? What is a sect? Basically a group that splits off of a larger religion and attracts those dispossessed in the larger religious group. So modern Pentecostals split from mainline Protestantism. And initially were made up of lower class individuals in terms of Pentecostalism, and a cult, right? So generally a new faith, or at least a new faith in the society being examined. And where do cults actually flourish? Well, cults tend to flourish in the middle and upper classes because, they tend to be offering things, for Stark anyway, because he's here in his life, he's writing in terms of rational choice theory, especially. He says that cults will offer, basically compensators for things that you can't earn once you have enough kind of money. Okay, So, who is Paul? St. Paul, right? Did we talk about this? We talked about Paul. Ah, all right. St. Paul. So St. Paul is an early Christian kind of apostle, right? He basically never meets Jesus, but shortly after Jesus is killed, Paul is a Jewish official, a Pharisee, kind of part of the religious elite of the Jewish society, trained by a very famous Jewish teacher called Gamaliel, and Paul takes it upon himself to persecute this new group called the Christians that have, he thinks, kind of warped Jewish beliefs, right? Because they believe that this guy who was crucified, Jesus, obviously, is somehow the Messiah, and that he was raised from the dead, and that somehow he is God. And so Paul is on his way from Jerusalem to Damascus, basically to persecute Christians in Damascus. When on the road to Damascus, he sees a vision of a bright figure who asks him, Paul, why are you persecuting me? And of course, this is Jesus. Paul goes blind, ends up getting to Damascus. His companions get him to Damascus. He's blind for 3 days, at which point he meets a Christian named Ananias, who baptizes him, and then the scales fall from his eyes, right? So he's able to see again. And from then on, he changes the name from Saul to Paul, and he becomes, one of the most fervent and important preachers of early Christianity. A lot of the book of Acts follows Paul, and Paul has 7 genuine and several pseudo-Pauline letters in the New Testament. Yeah, please.
Just wondering back to the idea that according to Stark cults trying to target middle and upper class, because I like looking at cults and stuff. It's fun. We all have our hobbies. Basically, from what I've always heard is that they go for the most disenfranchised people who are people who are new to a community, no one with they don't have any friends, or they just suffered a big loss, or they just had a big financial thing.
This is, I think, not always true. I think this is typically, more of a caricature of cults. A lot of them actually are targeting, not so much targeting, but they attract, right? So who do they attract, right? And yeah, there is certain things like what you're talking about, people who've suffered, a personal loss, people who are a little bit, disconnected from society. But often too, it's people who, are lacking kind of meaning in their lives, right? They are, looking for meaning, right? This is a lot of what cults actually attract, is people who, in a lot of cases, have enough wealth, right, that they can sort of think about the meaning of life, and they're finding that whatever religious system is kind of available to them isn't providing them with that meaning. So they start to look for other people, and they're open to, people who are preaching different kinds of religious systems. People who have, a lot of meaning in their lives, who are well established, especially in a religious system that appeals to them, aren't going to be looking for cults. It's those people who are kind of on the fringe and who find the religious systems that are available not meaningful enough, right? It's not answering their ultimate questions. But at least Stark thinks, and I think there's a fair bit of evidence for this, right? Even if you look at Christian Science, when Christian Science was getting off the ground and it was kind of culty, maybe it still is. Or certainly Scientology, right? Scientology has tended to look for people who are pretty wealthy, who are looking for meaning, right? That they are, think of Tom Cruise, right? Maybe Tom Cruise is a bad example, but he kind of fits the profile, right? He's super rich, but when he sort of encountered Scientology, his life was sort of meaningless, right? He was finding that he didn't have a lot of meaning in life, and there was nothing that sort of explained things. And so he was primed for something like Scientology to come in, because it offered him, I don't know, that the therons were unaligned in his chakra or whatever, and that made sense to him. But he was looking for meaning and basically wasn't finding it in other religious systems.
Could you argue that's why most New Age cults usually have some form of basis in a pre-established religion? Yeah, because it was Jim Jones who had he was a pastor.
Yeah.
It was everyone follow me? And they were like, yeah, sure, we're following Jesus. And they're like, oh, we are not following Jesus anymore.
Well, I mean, they sort of did until, right, most of them drank the Kool-Aid. Like,
Actually, no.
oh, did they not?
It was like forced.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'm remembering the Jonestown thing wrong. But yeah, anyway. Yeah, they went off to Latin America somewhere, right? And then you got poisoned by poisoned Kool-Aid and all that fun stuff. Where we get the expression, by the way, drinking the Kool-Aid comes from a cult where everybody died. It was bad. Okay. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Is everything we've talked about so far in the chapter from Stark's book? So the chapter that I posted is actually just one article. That's just one part of Stark's book. The rest is in the longer book that you don't have to read the entire thing. But you can easily find the PDF online if you're looking. But I couldn't get you an electronic copy. So I've just got the one chapter, which is the role of women kind of linked. And we'll talk about the role of women later. Did I explain who Paul is enough? Yes. All right. I refuse to answer any more questions about Paul at this point. All right. So, the rise of Christianity. All right. This is a chapter in the book, a really interesting one. So, in this one, Stark is going to ask, what role did disease, and especially two big epidemics that struck the Roman Empire, potentially play in the growth of Christianity, right? And how might this help explain how it rose so quickly? All right, and there's a little bit of speculative number doing in here, but I think it's an interesting kind of case. All right, so kind of in, the post kind of Jesus era, AD or C, whichever notation you prefer, and I tend to like using AD because, who made up the calendar? Well, it was the Jesuits, right? The calendar that we have, which is the most accurate calendar that any human has ever come up with, was created by the Jesuits, and they used the notation AD, or Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord. So I'll put it up in CE because that's the kind of academic standard, but I feel bad taking it away from the Jesuits, who created a really accurate calendar, so I'll say AD as well. All right, so in 165 AD, or CE, a deadly plague sweeps through the Roman Empire, right? And this plague, you think COVID was bad. This plague lasts 15 years in the Roman Empire. And while we don't have exact estimates, right? Most historians put the percentage of the Roman population that died in this plague at somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all people living in the Roman Empire. Some people think this is the first appearance of smallpox in the West, which would have been brought from China through the Middle East and Central Asia, the Middle East, into the Roman Empire through Persia. And basically, so it's probably the first instance of smallpox coming into the West. And, from historical accounts that we have from the period, right, and there's some great Roman historians living at the time, it was reported that somewhere in the range of 5,000 people a day were dying in Rome, right? And this was a city probably of around 1 million people at the time, right? So about the size of Edmonton today. And if, 5,000 people were dying a day in Edmonton, you can imagine the kind of psychological crisis this might cause. So that plague, abates by roughly the year 180, right? It starts to get better. And a second plague, hits the Roman Empire a little bit later in about 251 CE, and this one affects both, like the smallpox plague had probably just affected the cities mostly, but the second plague spreads both to the cities and the countryside. We think it was probably the measles, right? And again, a disease introduced from Asia into Europe, through the trade routes, and ultimately, kills a lot of people. Lots of historians have suggested that these plagues, probably sort of primed the Roman Empire for its eventual fall, right? They severely weakened the Roman Empire, reduced its population pretty substantially, therefore making it, they had less people to fight, less legionnaires to go. They had to rely more on essentially hiring soldiers from Germanic tribes, the very Germanic tribes that would eventually, sack and destroy Rome and the Western Empire in general. So it's, well understood that these plagues probably played a role in the decline of the Roman Empire. But what Stark says is few historians have sort of talked about how they might have helped spread Christianity. Certainly when he's writing his book, in the 1980s. Okay. Since then, again, Tom Holland talks about this, and it's become sort of an accepted historical fact. All right, so Stark has 3 theses about how the plagues may have helped Christianity grow. All right, so the first one is that basically the plagues swamped the explanatory and comforting capacities of paganism, the Greco-Roman religions and philosophies, right? Like, why was this happening? Well, it must be the wrath of the gods. And so what do you do to, appease the wrath of the gods? Well, you go and you perform the ritual sacrifices. And when that doesn't work, well, then what are the other explanations that kind of Greco-Roman religion and philosophy had to offer? Not much. For Stark, Christianity, and again with its roots in Judaism and, millennia of Jewish philosophy, offered a better and a more satisfactory account of why these terrible times had come and offered a hopeful vision of the future, right? So Christianity has a different vision of why suffering happens. And I'm forgetting the word for its, that's going to bother me. It's on the tip. It'll come to me in a sec. But religions have sort of explanations for why bad things happen. Christianity, right, will posit that the world is in a fallen state, right? That as a result of sin, the world has fallen into a state where disease and death reign over the world. But, Christianity also offers a kind of eschatology or end times kind of vision, that ultimately all things will be made right? That God is going to show up in the person of Jesus and make all things right. And, in Revelation, there will be no more tears, and the death will pass away, right? Death itself will sort of disappear from the world. Okay, so Christianity offers a more hopeful vision. Even for Greco-Roman religion, this is a point that Stark makes, there's not exactly a cheery vision of the afterlife in Greco-Roman religion, right? The underworld is a land of shades, right? It's a kind of gloomy place in general. And if you think of the myth of Persephone, going to the underworld is not like the underworld is like heaven in the way we think of it, right? Most people end up in kind of shades, and eventually they sort of end up in reincarnation, and they forget their life after drinking from the river Lethe. But it's not a happy place. The underworld is not a happy place. It's not like the Christian vision or the Jewish vision of heaven, right? Okay. So it offers a much more hopeful vision than Greco-Roman religion and philosophy. So the other thing that he suggests is that when disaster struck, the Christians were better able to cope, and this resulted in higher survival rates. And therefore, after each plague, and we'll get into the details of why you think this was, the Christians made up a greater proportion of the population. Moreover, their better survival rate would have seemed like a miracle, right? And therefore, it might have influenced conversion positively. And then the last one, right, related, I think, to the second one, when an epidemic destroys a substantial portion of the population, it leaves a large number of people without interpersonal attachments, right? If 1 in 3 people is dying during the plagues, right, there's going to be a lot of people left over who don't have interpersonal bonds, right? So what would have bonded them to conventional morality or Greco-Roman religion might have been weakened by these plagues, and therefore pagans would have lost bonds with other pagans and maybe built bonds with Christians, especially if Christians had a better survival rate. Okay, so these are 3 theses why he thinks the plagues probably helped grow Christianity. Okay. So, crisis of faith, right? I talked about this a little bit because I got ahead of myself. Religions often struggle during times of crisis, right? Offering substantial explanations for why things are happening. And during the plagues, pagan priests couldn't explain why, or even if the gods had sent these plagues, or how to fix them, right? The typical Greco-Roman sort of way of getting rid of the rage of the gods, if Apollo has sent down plague arrows upon thee, you go and sacrifice to Apollo. When that doesn't work, what is the other explanations that Greco-Roman religion had, right? How angry are the gods going to be and for how long? Added to that, the pagan priests, being the upper class fellows that they tended to be, had estates in the countryside, right? Now, when the cities were being struck down with plague, and obviously plagues are going to spread much more quickly in urban environments than in rural ones because they're more densely populated, what happened to the pagan priests and philosophers? Well, they got the hell out of Dodge, right? They went off to live at their country estates where they thought they would be safer because they had, not a really detailed knowledge of how disease spreads, but they had some sense, right? So you get away from sick people, you don't get sick, and that's what they do. The famous Roman physician Galen, right, fled Rome, right? He went off to live in his country estate. And what Stark says is why? Well, because Greco-Roman, philosophy couldn't offer answers, and Greco-Roman religion, offered no real sense of the afterlife, not a good one anyway. And so, if this life is sort of all you had, or the best chance you have of being happy, well, you're not about to stick around, to take care of people in a time of plague. It's great to be Galen the physician in times where there isn't plague, but once the plague hits, you go off and live in your nice country estate, away from all the sick peasants and slaves, and try to kind of wait out the plague. Okay, for Stark, Christianity offered a better answers, right? In terms of its theology as to why suffering happens. The word is still on the top of my tongue. Theodicy is the term, which is, a theory or a philosophy of suffering and evil. Why does suffering and evil exist in the world? That's theodicy. I remember the word. So it offered a better vision of why that was happening, and particularly a better notion of the afterlife, right? It doesn't matter if you suffer and die in this life, especially of disease, if the afterlife, you're reunited with friends and family in heaven, and it's a wondrous, joyous place, right? Death doesn't seem quite so scary. Okay, so rather than fleeing, Christians stayed in the cities, according to Stark. And this we know, from historical sources is correct. And part of the reason, at least, was that, the gospel or Christian religion commands it, right? It commands that you should try to care for the sick, right? So they stayed to try and take care of the people who were in the city. And here, the difference is quite marked, right? When pagans got sick with the plague, they were essentially abandoned by their friends and family, right? Because they knew if they hung around with these people, they too were going to get sick. The Christians did sort of the opposite, right? They actually hung around and tried to care for the people that were sick. Why? Ultimately, because it is commanded by the religion, right? Right out of the mouth of Jesus, there are words that say you need to care for the sick. What does this actually turn out to, though? The rates of death, and again, historical sources suggest, were actually lower for Christians than they were for pagans. And Stark points to this Easter letter from Dionysius, who I believe is in Alexandria, where he admits that most Christian homes had lost more than one member, but that the pagans had been hit much harder. More pagans were dying than Christians, right? Because why? They're being abandoned. Sometimes to the point if they got sick, their family threw them on a cart and rolled them out to the city's edge and dumped them in a ditch, right? Because it's I'm not getting sick and I'm not dying for you. The Christians not only cared for other Christians, but as much as possible cared for pagans as well, sometimes even bringing them back into the city where they had been dumped by their loving relatives and friends. Okay, so I won't read this whole thing because it's a big chunk of text, right? This is what's called the Judgment of the Nations. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. The takeaway from this, right, is, this is a sort of vision of the end times. And, when the Son of Man, or Jesus in this case, comes in his glory with angels, basically he's going to sort people into sheeps and goats. The sheeps, go to heaven. The goats go to hell. And the king says basically, to the sheep, what is he? I should actually find it. Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, you took care of me. I was in prison, blah, blah. You visited me. And then they're like, what? When did we do this? And they're like, when you did it to the least of these, you did it to me, right? So when you took care of the sick, you're actually taking care of God. And this is right out of the mouth of Jesus, right? And so this becomes a powerful command for Christians, right? And they're like, oh, these people are sick. Well, Jesus says take care of them, so that's what a good number of them do. Yeah, Jessica.
So going back to the third thesis of like, or not third, the second of like Christians were better able to cope. Would that coping be that they had, for lack of better terms, like a healthcare system of like, if a Christian was sick, they were more likely to get treated, and therefore they were more likely to get better?
Yes, that is on a future slide. Very, very good inductive thinking. Okay, yeah, let's our question as well. And yes, I was thinking of theodicy. Okay, so the judgment of the nations. So yeah, without advanced medical techniques, how much difference could Christian care actually make? Potentially quite a bit, according to Stark. And he's taking here from McNeil, who looked at the difference between people who get basic nursing, right, versus people who don't in kind of situations where they are sick. And basically, what it says is simple provision of food, water, maybe some cold compresses to kind of bring down fever or try to manage fever, will allow a person who's too weak to cope for themselves instead of dying miserably, right? So simple nursing, right? Simple care can actually reduce mortality quite a bit because, if people are sick, and you feed them, you give them some soup, right? Or some kind of broth, something to kind of keep their strength up. You make sure that they're hydrated, right? Your mom always told you drink lots of water when you're sick, right? So you have to keep hydrated. If a person is so sick that they can't get out of bed, and right, with smallpox and measles, that's a real possibility. But if someone is providing them with the basics of life, right, keeping them clean as well so they don't develop other kind of secondary infections, their chance of recovering is considerably higher. So just basic nursing can do the trick in a lot of cases. All right, I'm going to answer this question in a sec. So basically, again, we're going to do some speculative statistics with Stark here because, we don't have, exact numbers. But, basically what the kind of the McNeil piece that he cited on the last slide says is that, basically you can reduce mortality from about 30% without nursing to about 10% with nursing in terms of serious disease like smallpox or measles. So basically he assumes, one thing, 30% mortality for those without nursing, a 10% mortality for those with nursing, and a continued 40% growth in this kind of imagined Roman city, right? So this isn't real numbers. He's just kind of playing with the statistics to see what would happen if you had a Roman city of 10,000 people, right, hit by the plague, that first plague, that 15-year plague that we think was probably smallpox. So assuming that, Christians survive at a better rate because of better care, and pagans die a little bit higher rate, and still assuming that 40% kind of growth. So what would it have looked like, in terms of the proportion of pagans to Christians in this particular case? Okay, so again, imagine this is not real numbers. He's just playing around to see what happens. And actually, sorry, I should just answer that question quickly. If Christians are caring for the sick, isn't there a higher chance of them becoming sick as well and dying? So the thing is that Stark will suggest on this question is that yes, they will get sick at a higher rate, but then more of them will recover because they're getting that basic care. And then once you've been sick with the disease, you can almost what he suggests is, right, you're not going to get reinfected by the same disease again, especially with smallpox, right? Once you've had it once, you don't get it again. And same with measles, right? They're not rapidly mutating viruses. So it's not like there's seasonal ones like the flu. And so it would have looked like then Christians could move through a lot of the sick population. You got sick and you recovered. And basically you look like kind of like you're being protected by God because you're moving through and taking care of sick people and not getting sick, right? So yeah, some people would die, but a lot of people would recover. And then those people are immune from the disease. And it looks like a miracle. And my screen just went dark and now it's back. Okay. All right. So what does our theoretical city look like? Again, after these two plagues, right? So 165, there's this population of 10,000 people, 40 of whom are Christian, and 9,960 who are pagans, for a ratio of 1 Christian for every 249 people. Okay, so, assuming these death rates, right, the population will drop by about 3,000 by the year 170. The number of Christians will only increase to 52 initially, and the population of pagans, will reduce to a little under 7,000 for a ratio of 1 to 1 in 197. I can read numbers, I swear to God. After the second epidemic, right, the population of the city is about halved, but you see the kind of percentage change, right? So on about 100 years with this 40% per decade growth rate, 30% mortality for those without nursing, 10% for those with nursing, you now have almost 1,000 Christians for 4,000 pagans, about 1 in 4. And then, so after the second plague, this is what he thinks it would have looked like. The ratio naturally would have ended up at about 1 to 4, right? So a much more favorable ratio. Now, if there had been no plagues, and he says, all you had was that 40% conversion rate, you still had a pretty big growth of Christians, right? From about 40 to about a little over 1,100. But the ratio would have been much smaller. So what's the kind of takeaway of this then? Do I have this on the next slide? Yes, hang on, let me just talk about this really quickly. Is that it would have created a more favorable ratio of Christians to non-Christians in late antiquity, right? That basically the plagues would have reduced the pagan population substantially, more so than it did the Christians. The Christians would have still experienced their conversion growth, but that basically, because of the plagues, the ratios kind of shift, and the Christians look like a much bigger part of the population than they otherwise would have been, right? So even though, there's less Christians here, after, in this 100-year period, than there would have been without the plagues, ultimately, they're a bigger proportion of the population. And that just means they're more visible, right? So now Christianity looks like a much bigger part of Roman society, and it's much more visible. And again, now it's maybe generated this kind of positive reputation as people survive who are Christian. Okay, I can get through this slide in 3 minutes. Okay, so types of network bonds, right? And basically, Stark posits that, in late Roman society, there would have been kind of 3 types of social bonds, bonds between Christians and Christians, bonds between Christians and pagans, and bonds between pagans and pagans. Okay, so back to this kind of theoretical city that he imagines. The chances of a social bond surviving, based on our mortality rates, Christian to Christian bonds would have had an 81% chance of surviving. Hey, right, because they're being cared for, their mortality is going to be lower. Bonds between Christians and pagans have a almost 63% chance of surviving, and pagan to pagan bonds, less than half of them survive, slightly less than half of them. Okay, that model assumes no one leaves, right? If we assume that 20% of the pagan population fled, which we know pagans did, right? Then the Christian to Christian bonds stay the same because most Christians stuck around. Christian to pagan bonds, they survive 45% of the time, and pagan to pagan bonds only survive 25% of the time. Okay, so what's Stark's kind of takeaway? The plagues would have significantly weakened the bonds between people who were pagan, right? Leaving a good number of them, so those who had just pagan to pagan bonds, right, kind of socially unattached. Meaning that, again, they would be more inclined to perhaps form bonds with Christians, which would have just kind of so the bonds tying pagans to pagans would have been remarkably weak after the epidemics, meaning it's much more likely that they would form bonds with Christians and potentially convert, right? So if we think of conversion to a religion as ultimately happening because of social bonds, after the plagues, right, there's a much stronger chance that people would have no bonds and therefore be looking for social bonds, allowing Christians to move into that space, or that pagans would have surviving bonds with Christians, meaning a chance that they would convert, right? Because suddenly, if half the people are Christian or whatever, you're more likely to convert, right? Again, so this is a theoretical model, right? He's just kind of bringing it up to say there's a really good chance that these epidemics would have enhanced the reputation of Christianity, and left people in a situation where their social bonds were remarkably weakened, thus making them more kind of amenable to conversion to Christianity. Okay. So I guess we will start on the role of women next time because I only got 1 minute left. It's a really kind of fascinating look because Stark actually thinks that compared, like we might not think of it this way, but women were probably instrumental to the rise of Christianity in being its most passionate advocates. All right, so we will pick that up next time.